see you guys in the dark.
To give a little background information, this started in the winter of 2012. I was 23 years old at the time and living with my dad. My mom and my brother were living in another house about 10 minutes away from us. One morning I woke up around 8 a.m. because I had an early doctor's appointment, and I went outside to see a note pinned to the windshield wiper of my car. The note said, "I'm going to kill you, fucking pedophile scum." I kind of just laughed it off. I assumed the note was for my dad, who had a habit of complaining to parents in our neighborhood about their children's shitty behavior. There were these twin boys who liked to try and catch and torture squirrels. He often marched them home by the ears to complain about them to their parents. I thought one of the parents was just being a douchebag, so my dad and I didn't bother with it too much. Later in the day, while talking to my mom on the phone, I mentioned the note to her offhandedly in a very casual way, and I was shocked by her response. She responded by very empathetical, warning me several times to make sure all of my windows and doors were locked, and to bring a weapon to bed with me at night. I was a bit taken aback, because she never said anything to me like that before. She never even given me a good touch, bad touch talk. She reminded me at least 12 times over the course of the conversation to bring a knife or a baseball bat to bed with me, and to lock my bedroom door at night. I thought she was just overreacting, so I just waved her off. Then other weird things started happening. We started getting random packages and deliveries sent to our house. Bibles and Qurans, newspapers, porn flyers, pizzas, and moving trucks that we hadn't ordered. The first few times it happened, I thought it was a mistake. But as it kept happening, I came to the conclusion that somebody must be pulling a prank on us. We didn't know who it was, so there's nothing we could really do about it but apologize profusely to yet another confused pizza delivery man. In September of that year, I started taking a night school class with my best friend. The course went from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. every Monday and Wednesday night. And after the class, his mom would pick us up and drive us home. Sometime in November, his mom dropped us off from school, and I went inside and chilled on the couch for a couple of hours. I like to wind down before I go to bed a bit, or I can't sleep at all. I ended up falling asleep on the couch. Something woke me up abruptly at about 4 o'clock in the morning. I heard the unmistakable sound of a car tire being slashed, and it sounded like our car. What the hell was going on? We didn't have any enemies. In retrospect, this was probably a stupid thing to do, especially considering that I'm a relatively small female. I'm only 5'5", and I was 23 at the time. But I grabbed a generic knife from the kitchen and went outside to check it out. When I got outside, I discovered immediately that I was correct. There was a man in our driveway, slashing our car tires. Unwisely, I immediately yelled, "Hey, you!" and he turned around to face me. That was when I noticed that he was slashing our tires with an enormous hunting knife, at least 6 inches long. He looked surprised, but then defiant, and began to advance towards me with the knife slightly raised. I just froze. I didn't know what to do. He was coming at me so fast, I couldn't even think. Thankfully, at that exact second, my across-the-street neighbor, who also heard him slashing our tires, turned on his porch light and yelled out the window, "Hey, I'm calling the cops." The man yelled back, "I don't give a fuck. Call them then." Then he retreated back to his car, where I could see a middle-aged woman with long brown hair waiting for him in the passenger seat. Our eyes locked, and I knew instantly that we had met before, but I couldn't quite put my finger on when or where. I just knew in my gut that I had met this woman before. They sped off into the night, and we called the cops, who said that they couldn't do anything for us because they didn't know who had done it. I mean, isn't that kind of your job, though? To find out who did it? Herp-a-derp. I called my mom to tell her what happened, and to ask her if she had any idea who would have done this to us. She immediately said no, but there was something in her voice. I could just tell that she wasn't being honest. A few weeks later, I decided to go to my mom's house to spend a day or two there, determined to get some answers from her. As soon as I walked in the front door, I knew something was wrong. The second that she saw me, she just started bawling her eyes out. She took me by the hand and sat me on the couch and explained the whole story to me, start to finish. It's a little necessary for me to give a little background information here. My mother is a businesswoman by trade. She was still in sales at the time. But she's also a bit of a hippy-dippy, astrology and pot and reincarnation, Mercury is retrograding type, so don't get into any arguments this week, type of lady. On the side of her regular day job, she was also selling Arbonne makeup, which is an all-natural brand of makeup that is free of parabens, oils, sulfates, and other common cosmetic additives. A couple of months before this all started, she had ended up being referred a new client named Andrea by her weed dealer. Yes, my mom smokes. This is Canada. Everybody smokes here. Andrea was her dealer's girlfriend, and she was interested in buying some makeup. So my mom invited her over to her apartment to look at some makeup samples. They started chatting a bit about a variety of topics, as women usually do, and my mom let it slip that her last name was Hayes. As my mom told me, Andrea had paused for a few seconds, looked at her, and then said, "Hayes? Did you used to be married to a man named Darren Hayes?" My mom answered that yes, Darren Hayes, who was my father, was her ex-husband. And then shockingly, this Andrea woman had actually burst into tears, threw her arms around my mom in a hug, and began to tell her this horrific story about all the disgusting things that my dad had done to her. Apparently, when she was 14 years old, she was now in her mid-30s. I would have been about 4 years old at the time, so this would have happened around 1994. She had been dating a man named Andrew, who happened to be living with my dad at the time after my parents' divorce. According to Andrea, these men were her boyfriend Andrew, Andrew's twin brother Daniel, and my father, had taken turns beating her, raping her, and then forcing her to prostitute herself in order to make a little bit of money off of her. Eventually, they ended up selling her into child prostitution, from which she said she never recovered. At this point, I realized that this is where I'd recognize her from. My dad had been roommates with her boyfriend, Andrew, and I used to see all three of them when I went over there to visit him every second weekend. She sobbed during the whole retelling of this story, telling my mother how after this traumatic experience, she had turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of her abuse, and that she'd been addicted to crack and alcohol off and on ever since because of what my father had done to her. My mom was shocked. She didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she knew my father to be a generous, soft-spoken, and kind person who had never lifted a finger on her or any other person, and who rarely raised his voice. But on the other hand, it seemed odd that Andrea would just happen to remember his name all these years later, if she had been lying to her at least. She didn't know who to believe. After several hours of crying and much consoling on my mother's part, Andrea finally left. That was when the stalking began. A few days after this encounter, my mom came home from work to find Andrea's boyfriend sitting on her couch, waiting for her. He immediately told her that he was planning on killing my dad, and that my dad deserved to die because he was a pedophile, rapist piece of shit, and that if my mom told anybody at all, especially the cops, that he would be sure to kill her as well. He then concluded his threat by describing the layout of our living room and exactly what outfit I was wearing that day. From then on, he and/or Andrea would text or call her several times a day to threaten and taunt her, telling her that they were going to call the cops on my dad and have him thrown in prison, that they were going to have him killed, and that if she told anybody, they would hire somebody to rape and murder me. Naturally, my mother was absolutely terrified. She was from an upper-middle-class family who had immigrated to Canada from Germany. She had never dealt with this type of person before. She stopped eating, she couldn't sleep, and even stopped going to work. She lost 30 pounds, and her hair started falling out from all the stress. She started having panic attacks because she didn't know what to do. Later, she told me that she understood how I felt now, because I have an anxiety disorder that causes me to experience panic attacks. Eventually, after the night when I almost got stabbed, she decided that she had to call the cops. She couldn't take the chance that they would hurt me. She had to do something about it, and what she found out was shocking. Andrea was well known to the police. When my mom told them this story, she was so well known that they weren't even surprised to hear her story. In fact, they told her Andrea had done this exact same thing to at least a dozen other men. She would meet and blackmail men into giving her money, electronics, drugs, things like that, threatening to call the cops and report them for rape if they didn't. Her boyfriend, who was a dealer to other drugs than just weed, as it turned out, would often use his drug connections to intimidate and extort the men. And for some reason, he never questioned her story of being raped, abused, and enslaved by all these different men, because there is no doubt in my mind that he genuinely believed that she was telling the truth. Then when Andrea, who was a crack and heroin addict and prostitute, would get arrested on a possession or drug distribution charge, she would attempt to make deals with the police by offering them information about men who were rapists and pedophiles in exchange for less time in prison. She eventually did this so many times that the police stopped believing her. After my mom called the cops, the whole story came undone, and Andrea and her boyfriend, thankfully, haven't bothered us since. But it's been over a year since the whole thing happened, and I'm still terrified to leave the curtains open at nighttime in case somebody is watching me. I don't think I'll ever be able to feel fully safe in this house ever again. So Andrea, let's not meet again. Ever. I'm going to clear up some of the common questions that people have asked about this. First of all, I know some of you think this part is suspicious, but I assure you that it actually did happen to us. She remembered my dad because he used to be her boyfriend's roommate. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear in the beginning. My dad was sharing an apartment with two twins named Andrew and Daniel, and Andrea was dating Andrew at the time. That's where I remembered her from. I used to go over there every second weekend just to visit my dad, and I used to play Lion King on Sega Genesis with Andrew all the time, and she was always hanging off of him. When I was 19, my parents came to visit me during one of my college breaks. They stayed at a Holiday Inn, which was surprisingly rather nice given that it was located in a seedy section of town right off of I-95. After a day of doing various activities throughout the city, we retired to their hotel room to order some pizza and watch some amazing basic hotel cable. After some quality time spent with the folks, I grabbed the leftover pizza and walked to my truck, which was only about 20 yards away from their room. I got into the truck and started her up, ready to head back to my apartment, when I was greeted with a quick knock on the window. It was a middle-aged white woman who was a little weathered looking. I rolled down the window about halfway, and she started with one of those fake-ass stories every panhandler and bum starts off with. The kind where you immediately start tuning out after the first few words, because you know it's complete and utter bullshit. I cut her off, blurting out some excuse as to why I couldn't drive her to the gas station. At least I think that's what she needed. She took it surprisingly well, then saw the pizza box sitting in the passenger seat. Her eyes brightened and asked me if she could have a slice. I told her no, that I didn't have much food, and this is true, I was a poor college student, and that I loved pizza. She then licked her lips and told me if you give me a ride to the store and a slice of that pizza, I'll suck you off. For whatever reason, I was completely flabbergasted by this random comment, and all I remember doing is grabbing a fistful of change out of my cup holder and basically chucking it at her and driving off. Not sure why I reacted like that. To this day, almost 8 years later, I'm still reminded of this encounter because I have a squeaky noise when I roll down my driver's side window, because a coin got lodged in there when I threw the change at her. I still laugh at it today, because given the proximity of my parents' hotel room, they would have stepped out at any time and would have seen their son being solicited by some hooker who gives out BJs for pizza. I'll make this short. I hope that I'm doing this right. This happened back in 2012. I was a recent transplant to North Carolina, and I had recently lost my job and headed to the Bay Area. I decided while I was looking for a job, I'd stay in a Motel 6 in East Oakland with my pit bull, Jeromeo. One night I decided to walk about a quarter of a mile up the road to Jack in the Box with Jeromeo for a late-night snack. On my way back, as I'm walking across the entrance to an abandoned hotel, a shitty little Ford Focus cuts in front of me, cuts me off, and abruptly stops. I don't know if my explanation will do the next part justice, but I will try. Out of the car hops an overweight lady, dressed like a drag queen with shabby clothing. Threads were frayed. There were old stains on her shirt, and her hair was a mess. Before I could see her face, she started talking to me. It was almost like she was hiding her face. The words I could make out of her garbled sentence were date and baby. It sounded like she had a mouthful of marbles. I tried to ignore her and continued walking, but she cut me off again, with her body this time, and tried to touch my arm. When she reached out for my arm, I got a glimpse of her face. This is when I got freaked out. She was a black lady, like Denzel's shade. Her face was riddled with what looked like open sores and pock marks. There was a sheen of liquid that covered her entire face that looked like a pus and blood mix. It had a greenish-pink tint to it. I noticed this on the back of her hands, too. You can imagine that I was thoroughly disgusted. I instantly went into flight mode, sidestepped her, and dragged Rome away from her. Quickly, she protested with a mouthful of jibber-jabber, but I kept moving on, quickly. I looked back to see her car pulling out and heading in the opposite direction. So, crackhead, prostitute, zombie lady, I really don't want to see you again. After telling a few people about what took place, a lot of advice from people who told me, ultimately, the cost of legal fees to deal with this woman would have been insane. So we decided that before we went that route, we'd see if we could be deterred without a straight-up lawsuit. We contacted the police department again, and they had an officer to go to the crazy woman's house, basically tell her that she had to stop, or she was going to be in deep shit. After that, things were pretty quiet until a few days before Thanksgiving, when I once again came home to find a person in my driveway. This time, though, it was a much more pleasant experience. It was the crazy Mombies adult. I'd guess 30-something, with son, wanting to apologize to me for his mother's insanity, and fill me in on what his family was doing about her. He was a very nice dude, and was really candid about answering all the questions that I had. According to the adult son, Mambia had been taking her children on hikes that cut through my property for years. He explained that people who lived there before us had been cool with it, and his mother had caught his younger brother, who was high school aged, looking at me through my window a few times when they walked through my yard, and was extremely upset about it because she felt as though my presence was corrupting their mother-son time. Her son told me that he thinks that inciting incident for his mother's spiral into insanity was when the teen son pointed me out to the adult son in front of Mombi. She told me she got really upset and cried in her room for a whole night and screamed at everyone who tried to talk to her. He thinks that's probably around when she started sneaking into my yard on her own and taking pictures of me. He claims the rest of the family had no idea that she had done this, or that she was circulating a petition to spreading rumors about me until the police had shown up at their door to tell her that she had to stop her bad behavior. After the police came over, her family confronted her. She basically had a huge freak out. Apparently, she believed I was trying to seduce all the men in her family and threatened to kill herself. The cops were called, and ultimately, she was committed. Adult son informed me that this wasn't the first time his mother had gone nuts, and that all of her freakouts had involved her paranoia about non-Jewish women. This family is Jewish, by the way, who were even somewhat near the family. The neighborhood we moved into is a very Jewish place, and we might be the only non-Jewish people around, so perhaps that truly did trigger her. So as of now, she's in an institution. I exchanged contact information with her adult son, and he will inform me about what's happening with her, like if she's getting out, and I will call him if she's ever in my damn yard again. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night, and I'll see you next time.